Good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. I want to thank Michael and Senya and also Esther and everyone who's helped to make this a wonderful time. I'm super excited to be at the Art Student League. There we go. This is a formative place for so many artists, probably some of you, and many of the artists that I've studied, including Hervé Télémaque, whose work you see here on the screen. This work is called Éclaireur, The Guide, and Télémaque came to the US from Haiti, and he studied here in 1957 with Julien Levy, and then in 1960 went on to Paris, just one of the amazing connections with this amazing school. I hope my comments tonight, like his painting, Hervé Télémaque's painting, can be a bit of a provocation for you to think differently about Surrealism. At least that's my goal. Nearly 100 years ago, in October 1924, writer, poet, and artist André Breton wrote a manifesto that formalized ideas that had been circulating around in the Parisian air for a little while, certainly before 1924, and those ideas were around an idea called Surrealism. In the aftermath of the First World War and steeped in the ideas of Sigmund Freud and Karl Marx, Breton defined Surrealism as, quote, psychic automatism in its pure state, by which one proposes to express the actual functioning of thought. Thought dictated in the absence of any controlled exercise by reason, exempt from any aesthetic or moral concern. Super important. Like that's it. Surrealism was claimed in his manifesto, but it was announced in a number of other ways. For many Parisians not hooked into the tight-knit group of Breton's circle of writers and poets, their encounter with Surrealism might have been while walking down the street in Paris and seeing something like this on a wall. It says, parents, tell your children your dreams. Or they might have settled into a cafe and found something like this on the table. Those who cannot see, think of those who can. Or here's another one. Open your mouth like an oven and out will come chestnuts. Or this one that finally names this mysterious thing. Surrealism is within the grasp of all unconscious minds. So perfect. It was these little provocations, they're about the size of a business card, that are called papillons. So in French, butterfly, think of these things kind of fluttering down into the city of Paris, but also flyers that I think really announce Surrealism to the public. Here's another one. If you love love, you'll love Surrealism. And you're not wrong if you see a little degree of advertising in this as well. It's important to note in all this humor, though, that there are no images associated with this idea, right? It's just text. It's part of the imagination. The art, I'd like to say, was in the, I'm sorry, these fonts are sort of hard to read. The art was in the action, one of making something intended to interrupt so-called normal life. Right? Something that urged a radically new way of thinking, of seeing, of being. The invitation was open to anyone as long as you were open to receive it. When we encounter the word surrealism today, or something surreal today, though, it's not a surprise like this, is it? It's everywhere, this word. And it's come to mean things that like bizarre, unexpected, strange, unimaginable. In fact, and this is actually a long time ago now, but in 2016, Merriam-Webster Dictionary had surreal as the word of the year, but that could be today, right? Just transpose those pictures, and it's something absolutely that has to do with this kind of continued, unexpected, unimaginable state that we seem to be living in. The popularity, though, of this word belies Surrealism's true potential, I think, to challenge authority and routine in order to free us in many ways, free us in many forms, whether it be political, social, artistic, sexual, or really anything otherwise. The first adherents of Surrealism were poets and writers, but fine artists, of course, soon joined Breton's group, and they added to ways that one could tap into one's unconscious to discover these kinds of unconscious desires. Art soon became the new calling card for the movement, I would say, and the two main routes are represented by the works that you see on the screen. Ernst's work that's at MoMA, Two Children Threatened by Nightingale, so the idea of tapping into dreams, whether they're actual dreams or sort of fever dreams in the case of Ernst, or imagined dreams, but that state of kind of unbridled, uncivilized, your mind just creating. Sometimes you remember it, sometimes you don't. And then Masson and his interest in automatism. Maybe some of you right now might be are doodling on your pad, or when you're on the phone, that moment when your hand is disconnected from your brain, it's doing what it wants to, it's not being corrected or controlled in any way. That's that kind of wellspring that the surrealists and the artists especially connected wanted to get at. But if we think of surrealism, so these are sort of early moments at the beginning of surrealism, but if we think about surrealist art today, we probably think about things like this, right? The Lobster Telephone, it's great work, or Magritte's False Mirror. And by the way, it also inspired CBS's original logo in the 50s. So again, that kind of hand-to-hand clasp of surrealism and advertising is part of the story somehow. These works are wonderful, but again, I'd like to suggest, just like the popularity of the word, that they've clouded our understanding of surrealism. In a way, they've become a blind spot. We need to remember that surrealism is not a style, at least not like something like Cubism that has a very defined, identifiable visual look. And surrealism is not a movement, at least not a movement in the kind of sense of something like Futurism that had a manifesto that then turned into a specific style that also had a kind of developmental end. It's really a different kind of movement. It's an intellectual offer, truly, that was open to anyone, and it traveled to many places around the globe, and I'll speak more about that in a minute. If we want to think more openly about surrealism, I would say we actually could look at Magritte, who on the eve of World War II explained, quote, "Surrealism claims for our waking life a freedom similar to that we have in dreams. New technicians, meaning new artists, need only concentrate on modifications to our habit of seeing only what we choose to see." So he's urging us to look past again. Surrealism, then, is a state of mind, an interrogation, a possibility, a power to instigate, to imagine a position beyond what one might be given. A few years after Magritte's statement, and miles across the Atlantic on the island of Martinique, poet Suzanne Césaire connected surrealism's promise of freedom to an ongoing precarious state in the world connected to racism and in social injustice. And she called, quote, "for a permanent state of readiness. Our surrealism," she wrote, "will enable us to finally transcend the sordid antinomies of the present and to draw directly from the wellspring of life." Surrealism, as Césaire saw it, was the tightrope of our hope. And it was an idea of surrealism, this kind of idea of surrealism, that was actually the thing that traveled out of Paris in 24 and into the world. So by the 1930s, the word surrealism really had moved out into the world through print, through radio, through film, of course, through art and exhibitions. And this is the movement of surrealism, really. And if we think about it this way, we can actually see surrealism, find surrealism in a much more open and much more expansive way than something like Dali's Lobster Telephone, as great as it is. So with the moments I have left, I just want to share a couple of those kinds of ways that we can find surrealism if we don't look for a specific style. So this is an example. This is a work by Zhao Zhu. It's called Color from 1934, and it's an example from China. In China, there was a small group of artists. They were called the Independent Art Group. They published a journal in 1936, one specific issue of it, Yi Fang, that's called Art Wind, that was dedicated to surrealism. And the work, the image you see in the middle is actually Zhao Zhu's translation of Breton's Manifesto of Surrealism from Japanese into Chinese. And the group up here is the Independent Art Group, and Zhao Zhu is the second one from the left. Now, how is this surreal? It doesn't look like Masson, it doesn't look like Ernst, but that group of artists translated the actual ideas of Surrealism, moving past freedom, trying to use Surrealism as a way to push against conventions in a very specific way. This is the time when China is under Japanese rule. And so this is a work that's a bit coded, but it's really proclaiming a kind of independence for China. So we've got these, if you can kind of imagine them as figures, we've got these masks, so it relates to the Chinese opera, and then there's a predominance of the color red, which of course is an important color in Chinese art that talks about sort of moral rectitude and correctness. And so it's these very coded symbols that are Zhao Zhu's way of proclaiming a kind of freedom, artistic certainly, as well as political, through a work. Here's another example in Egypt in 1937. This is a work by Mayo. It's called Baton Blows. And it's made by a man named Mayo, who was part of the group that you see up here. They were called Art and Liberty Group. And they, too, were interested in a kind of freedom as an idea for Surrealism. They wrote a manifesto that was really tied to a criticism of the British presence in Egypt at the time. And they were very much connected to an international stage. Many of them studied in Paris and came back with these ideas. They saw their work as connected to what was happening in the rest of Europe, but they were also very connected to local concerns. So this is an image that, while it may look, maybe it looks like Masson, I'm not sure. I think it just looks like a wonderful abstract work, very pleasant pastel colors, but the more you look, you'll see a broken bottle, and you'll see a tie, and you'll see some kind of forms at the top that are actually batons. This is a student uprising that's being quelled. I thought it was maybe appropriate to show tonight here in our surreal moment in New York. And then here's another example. Surprise. Doesn't look like a lobster telephone. This is Francoise Sullivan, a Canadian artist, part of a group in Montreal who were called Les Automatistes. And the idea for this group and their manifesto, Total Refusal, was, quote, to refuse all intention, the harmful weapon of reason, and to make for magic, for mysteries, and for what is needed, end quote. For Sullivan, she was part of this group and very much interested in being present-minded, to not bring with her tradition, to move outside of convention. And so she staged this surrealist performance in 1948 that was filmed. These are stills from the performance. We only have these left today. That was called Dance in the Snow, and she made one for every season. And truly just a kind of automatic, improvised performance with just the crunching snow under her feet as her score. One more example, this one from the United States. This is an artist named Skander Bogosian who came from Ethiopia and traveled from Paris and London, ended his career in Washington, D.C. The work is called Night Flight of Dread and Delight. It was made in 1964, and Skander's really an amazing person. He came to London and to Paris, and while he was there, he got connected into a group of artists who were very interested in Pan-Africanism and negritude, and spent a lot of time with Lam, so learned about Surrealism from artists in Paris, especially Wilfredo Lam, but with this very specific focus, again, of Surrealism as something that can allow for freedom, imagining a freedom beyond what one can have. He was also really interested in dreams, and so Bogosian takes, well, he prefers to be called Skander, which is why I'm being overly familiar with him. But Skander moved through Surrealism, brought those ideas together with, he was very interested in Amos Tutuola, a Nigerian magic realist novelist, the ideas of Tutuola's work, also interested in Coptic mysticism from his homeland, and also Pan-African mythologies, and brought all of that together to make this work, which has this incredibly encrusted surface of little bits of collage and paint, and it has a kind of wonderful sort of dreamlike quality. And finally, one last example as we sort of travel around the globe. This is a work by Malagatanya Nuenya, who lived in Mozambique during a time when Mozambique was still under the control of Portugal. And he learned about Surrealism from some of his teachers who were Portuguese expats who were working in Mozambique. Mozambique, of course, at this time was also under Portuguese rule, and Nuenya was part of the uprisings against this control, ended up in prison I don't sort of want to be paraphrasing his story, but I want to be mindful of Natalie's time up here. But when he got out of prison, he actually used Surrealism as a way to work through those experiences. Surrealism made sense to him as a vocabulary to try to share them with others. It would be very hard if we put this together with a Dali, right? To imagine them both as surrealists, but Malagatana Nueña very much saw himself as part of Surrealism. In fact, he said he found himself in Surrealism, which I find is a kind of amazing thing. And while he was making these works, he was also participating along with other artists in this movement, this network of African artists who are interested in Surrealism, in exhibitions in Europe and the United States, Surrealist exhibitions in the 60s and 70s. So very much kind of juggling both of these kind of things. So I only offer these small examples tonight. There are many more that I could offer, just as a way to suggest how we can easily get caught in our own habits, whether they be understanding surrealism or using the word surreal to describe something when it's actually not surreal, whether we think of surrealism in an artwork and only think of one kind, but also for ourselves, because I'm sure some of you in the audience are artists, writers, filmmakers, composers, and that surrealism is something that has no style. It's really an invitation, and it's open to all of us if we're open to receive it. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Stephanie, for those amazing remarks. Thank you so much to Michael, Senya, and Esther for the invitation. I'm going to be speaking about René Magritte and the Menil collection, which is where I am a curator in Houston, Texas. And so a little bit kind of the other side of Stephanie's talk with the artist that I think has in kind of the popular imagination become quite synonymous with surrealism, with the bowler hats and green apples and white fluffy clouds. But to kind of complicate that a little bit. So I wanted to just start with an image, because I imagine that perhaps some of you have not been to Houston or the Menil collection before, but this is the museum. The Menil collection is an art museum located in the center of Houston, Texas, and among many other kind of collection strengths, we have amazing holdings in surrealism, and notably, for my purposes tonight, the largest collection of work by René Magritte outside of Belgium. And so the question, this is one view of our galleries, here is another. And this can really be traced to the museum's founders. The museum is about 35 years old and was founded by John and Dominique de Menil, who over the course of several decades, beginning in the late 1940s, became really extraordinary evangelists for Magritte in this country. They supported major exhibitions of his work. They encouraged interest within other private collectors and museums. They originated major scholarly endeavors. And the question that I'm going to kind of explore tonight is something like, why and how, and where did this interest in René Magritte come from, and how did these two people's interest in Houston shape Magritte's reception and the life of his pictures in the United States? So I'm going to start in April 1947, when a relatively new gallery opened on East 55th Street here in New York, and opened with it the first post-war exhibition of René Magritte's work in the United States, and the first show of his in the United States in more than a decade. The person holding the bowler hat is Alexander Yolis, who was a Greek-born dancer turned dealer who became eventually the artist's exclusive representative in the United States, and wrote to Magritte a couple months before the show opened, saying, "We will do our best for this exhibition, which we hope will be the start for others in the future." And indeed it was. Among the gallery's financial backers were John and Dominique de Menil, who you see here. The de Menils were a French couple. They moved to Houston around the beginning of World War II and began to seriously collect art in the mid-1940s, and it was through Yolis that they discovered Magritte. And in the first few years of their association with him, they were not at all interested in Magritte, which I think it's interesting to note that that was really part of current trends back then. As New York eclipsed Paris as the center of the Euro-American art world, with the rise of abstract expressionism, Surrealism was really seen as too foreign. Its pictures were too narrative. Dominique de Menil later recalled that, "I always had the feeling that Surrealism was looked upon as one looks upon a member of the family who was gone astray." Jolis characterized the situation similarly with his typical flair. He was later asked, I think in the 80s, how the New York art world reacted to his shows of Surrealism in the 1940s and 50s. And he said, "Oh, they were considered the worst paintings on earth. Everyone said, 'Why do you show these horrors, this shit?'" So Jolis had a big personality. He was also infamously disorganized, perpetually late with payments, a very poor bookkeeper, but he had this really canny ability to use gifts as a way of sowing interest for certain artists within his kind of collector base, and that is how he got the de Menils kind of hooked on Magritte. So that process begins in 1948, when he organized the second show at the gallery, and from this display presented the de Menils with this picture. It was their first work by the artist. It's a painting called The Fair Captive. 1 year later, they traded it back. Apparently they didn't like it that much for this work, which is still in the collection, Alphabet of Revelations. When another year passed, though, the gift came back to them in a way, because Jolis gifted them with a smaller gouache version of The Fair Captive, so this work is still in the collection. As the decade turned, the gifts continued. So in 1950, the couple made a pretty significant acquisition for them. They'd only been buying art for a few years, and they bought a beautiful analytic Picasso, as Dominique called it. It was $6,500. It was their most expensive purchase to date. And in a very clever turn, Jolis subsequently gifted them this work by Magritte, which is a glass bottle, a glass wine bottle, titled A Rare Old Vintage Picasso, and which is painted by Magritte to mimic a 1914 analytical composition by Picasso. So we don't have a lot of correspondence or letters about this, but I think that this is just such a funny, sort of jokey way that Jolis was trying to encourage affection for Magritte by kind of tethering him to Picasso, and doing so within the de Menils, who were his best clients, and by that point, as I mentioned, his financial backers. So these gifts clearly worked. A couple years later, at Jolis's suggestion, the de Menils approached the Museum of Modern Art about a Magritte donation. Alfred Barr, the museum's first director, declined on the 3 paintings that they offered, but he allowed that we would like to see a good recent work by Magritte in the museum collection. And a year and a half later, they found the right painting, which is this one, Empire of Light, which is also called Dominion of Light, from 1950. And you can see it's in MoMA's collection. It was a gift from the de Menils. And this painting in particular, I think, looms quite large in the reception, the sort of fate of Magritte's fortunes in the United States. It's a composition that some of you may know, that sort of rings familiar. That's in one reason because he painted 17 versions of it between 1949 and 1965. So it is the most recurrent scene that he painted throughout his career. And I'm just going to take you through a couple examples. So here's the full group of 17 that he painted. And I will just note a few things. One is that the first version from 1949 was sold within the year of its making to the politician and businessman Nelson Rockefeller. We'll see this picture again in a little bit. It was a great success for Eolus. He wrote to Magritte saying, "One of the most important collectors bought Dominion of Light before the exhibition. I am very happy, as it's great publicity and will be the envy of all the other dealers who stuck up their noses when I was proudly fighting for you." So that's in 1950. In 1951, the de Menils gift the second version to MoMA. And then in 1953, they commission a version for themselves, this version. It's the fourth variant of the series, the fourth version that Magritte makes. They commissioned it through Eolus. They purchased it for $900. And in retrospect, this purchase of this composition seems to have been a kind of catalyzing agent for them, like it sort of unlocked something within them. In 1954, 1 year later, they purchased 2 Magritte paintings in January. They purchased 5 in May. Many of them are still in the collection. Oh, sorry, there's the MoMA picture again. So here are the works that are still in the collection that they bought, all within the span of 1 year. The next time the de Menils purchased work by the artist was a couple years later in 1956, and the work that they bought this time was another version of the Dominion of Light. So it's basically the painting that they loved so much, they bought it 3 times. They gave the first one to MoMA. The second one that I showed you a little while ago, they ended up gifting to one of their children, and then they bought one and held on to it this time. So this is the one that's actually still at the museum today. As the 1950s continued, the de Menils continued to buy art from Magritte. They are often buying a picture or so every year. But as the 60s arrive, they start to turn their attention from just building a personal art collection to really championing his work by beginning to plan exhibitions. And so sort of do more in a way for the artist in the United States. I'm skipping over a few very early ones to show you this one. This is René Magritte in America, which was the first exhibition of Magritte's at a museum in the States that opened in Dallas in 1960 before traveling to the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. It was a full retrospective of the career, all borrowed from American collections, and around 30 came from the Menil family, while others have some kind of connection, like that's the MoMA picture that they gifted to the museum a few years before this exhibition, rather. Magritte knew of the show. He contributed a statement to the catalog, and in this great, again, sort of joke about the double-barrel Texas venues, Dallas and then Houston, he contributed this ink drawing for the catalog that is captioned, as you can see, in English. This is not a derrick. A couple years later, we had another sort of major entry in Magritte exhibitions in the States. This time it was at the Arkansas Art Center in 1964. And this show was commissioned by Winthrop Rockefeller, who was the younger brother of the Nelson Rockefeller who had purchased the first Dominion of Light in 1950. So this is that painting that we saw a little earlier. And just as a side note, this painting was sold at auction, I think about 6 months ago, and Nelson Rockefeller had gifted it to his secretary, which is pretty great. So of the 104 works shown in Arkansas, a full quarter came from the de Menil family. And again, Magritte contributed a new drawing for the catalog. It was this work that you see on the left. It was a big rock for Little Rock. It was a pun that a lot of people remarked upon at the time. The local papers described the exhibition as making Little Rock, quote, easily the richest square block of Magritte's anywhere in the world at this time. And this show, this Arkansas show in 1964, is one that has really far-reaching consequences, somewhat surprisingly, for Magritte's star in the United States. In July '64, a curator from MoMA wrote to Dominique de Menil with his compliments. He had not seen the show, he said, but he very much admired the catalog. He said he had carefully studied it and found it very profitable, and continued, as you know, I'm passionately interested in the possibility of a Magritte show here, and quite frankly, would love to direct the exhibition, unquote. Less than a year later, preparations were underway for a major Magritte retrospective at MoMA. That show was eponymously titled René Magritte. It was the first full-dress retrospective to draw on both European and American collections, and it opened in New York in December of 1965. John de Menil wrote in response to the museum's loan request, saying, "This is going to be a long, winding, long-lasting exhibition, isn't it? And the paintings will be gone for over a year. We will play ball anyway." In fact, the exhibition had a quite long life. It traveled to more than 4 venues, and the de Menils lent a number of paintings to it. And that show played a quite decisive role in shifting René Magritte's fortunes in the United States. It accomplished a kind of important pivot or recontextualization for the artist, in which he was sort of less aligned now in the 60s with the antiquated and foreign and narrative and boring Surrealist movement from the 1920s. He was now seen as having some of the ironic deadpan and detached, cool sensibility of contemporary pop art. One critic wrote, after Jasper Johns and pop art, there seems to be something not only more cagey and owlish in Magritte, but more profound and liberating as well. And that retrospective, he said, was something of a revelation. So it's with this exhibition in New York in the mid-'60s that René Magritte comes to the United States to see that I think Magritte starts to become more of the icon that we know today, where he's more contextualized and seen alongside the cool, slick world of pop. This photograph has John de Menil, Alexander Calder, and Magritte, 1, 2, 3, at MoMA in 1965. And Magritte also came to Houston after that show, where they took him to a rodeo, which is pretty great. So Magritte dies a few years after that. He dies in 1967, and 2 years later, the de Menils begin discussions with his widow, Georgette, about initiating a catalog raisonné project. That did happen. It started in 1969. The de Menils were very concerned that it might take more than 5 or 6 years to finish the project. In the end, it took more than 20. The catalog raisonné was first published, the first volume of it is published in 1992. But that gives you a sense of the sort of rhythm of the de Menils' championing of Magritte, how they go from the 1950s, building the collection, putting together exhibitions that tour the country in the 1960s, and then in the 1970s, start to think about legacy building for the artist and want to kind of preserve or really memorialize, in a way, his art, his contribution for future generations. And then the building, the museum that I showed you at the beginning, opened in 1987 with, of course, the René Magritte collection that we still have today. So that's the end of my remarks, and I think we'll go chat now.
And just to start us off, I wanted to pose a personal question to you both. How has your relationships and your feelings towards Surrealism changed over the years as you've dedicated your scholarship to curating it? Is there something that you're pulling from it now that maybe you'd overlooked before? Or any new streams of thought?
I'll go first. I'll probably think of some things after I talk. Before I worked at the Met, I used to be in Chicago at the Art Institute of Chicago, which also has a great Surrealist collection. And I would say Chicago always prided itself as being, okay, New York has its ABEX, we've got Surrealism here, right? For whatever reason. And so when I came to work at the Art Institute, it was a very, I bet probably like Houston, like I was very proud of the place. That was a place where Surrealism came to. Moving here, certainly the Met has an interesting experience with Surrealism. We're doing better these days. That's just between us. But I would say, I did a show a couple of years ago on Surrealism, kind of beyond what we think about of Surrealism in a popular way. And I think that was a wonderful experience for me of thinking about Surrealism beyond a specific place and beyond specific collectors or artists, but really to think of the world in a much larger way. And it connected me, I think, with somehow contemporary things in a way that I hadn't thought about before. So from something local to something much, much wider.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that for me, coming to the Menil and really working with our Surrealist collection about 6 years ago, that has coincided with a tremendous explosion in Surrealism studies more broadly, and with a lot of amazing exhibitions like Stephanie's that have expanded and enlarged and sort of fruitfully complicated our pat understandings of Surrealism. And I think that one thing that I have tried to do in the Surrealism galleries at the Menil is have a more open and, kind of be less bothered about which artists were part of the movement and what it sort of means to be part of the movement. So, we have amazing collections of Magritte, obviously, and Max Ernst and Victor Bronner and Wilfredo Lam and Roberto Matta and kind of classic, Surrealist artists. But I have also really tried to bring in artists who are, thinking about Surrealist legacies or that we're just tangentially friends with, knew about, thought about the movement back in the day. I did a photo show a couple of years ago around Surrealist and surreal-ish photography that had some of our familiar names like Man Ray and Kertész and Lee Miller, but also I had a Diane Arbus photograph in the show. I had a Lorna Simpson collage. And so I think that's been one, change or sort of expansion of the understanding of Surrealism that's happened in the last little while, which is great.
Yeah. And you bring up Man Ray, who we were just looking at his student card earlier tonight. What made you, which I know, Stephanie, you're going to be working on a show soon on Man Ray, and you were just going into René Magritte with us tonight. I'm wondering what it is about these artists that are bringing you to curating shows about them today. What in the zeitgeist is pulling you, or in your current research might be pulling you to them?
Well, I think for Magritte, just to speak briefly, it's just such a collection strength, obviously, for us. We always have a Magritte gallery in Surrealism. I think one thing that I've tried to think about or, kind of do is to recover some of the strangeness of Magritte in the installations that I do or the artists perhaps that we show alongside him. He is an artist that, like I said at the beginning, I think is you say Surrealism today and people maybe think of the apples and bowler hats and white clouds and that whole thing, which is great, and that's a lot of the late work, and that's fine, but I think a lot of the eerie, unsettling, strange, earlier work is a lot of what attracts me. And so have had fun trying to foreground that more and sort of like introduce complications or like slow down people's thinking about Magritte, or making it less like automatic in a way. Yeah.
So, because I like to be an instigator, I'll say that I don't really think of Man Ray as a surrealist. I see him as someone who is adjacent to a lot of things. So I'm super interested in not so much surrealists, but surrealism as an idea, because I think, as you were saying, surrealish, like there are lots of artists who take things from surrealism and go off and do other things. That's still part of the life of the idea, part of the story that we can tell. And I think that Man Ray was happy to be involved in Dada and involved in surrealism. He was always on Breton's good side, but he never signed anything. He never signed anything. Never signed anything. He was glad for a show, but all did things other places. I'm interested in Man Ray's art, and not, you can attack me if you want. I don't think I would like him very much as a person. I say that as a woman, especially. But I'm super interested in his work, and I think, kind of like surrealism, he's someone who we think of the lips, or we think of like the eye and the metronome, but he actually was interested in something far more extraordinary about trying to sort of play with space in a lot of different ways in the way that he made his work. And the show that we're doing is focused on the rayograph. There's never really been a show, in the United States at least, on the rayograph as a way of making things and trying to connect it to more of his work in the 1910s and 20s, because he's an artist who's like, you see that, and it doesn't kind of go together. But actually the rayographs, we think, are a way where you can see connections between a lot of things. So I guess I'm always interested in surrealism and surrealist things, but Man Ray just happened to be an artist we sort of realized there was this kind of cool thing that we hadn't really looked at properly. So that's why I'm interested in him.
I love that term, the surreal-ish. That's great. You have the surrealist.
I think Breton would like that.
Surrealists. You don't think so? No?
No, I do not.
No.
I guess not. I mean, he did attack people for differing on their ideas. I think also I was noticing in the presentations these little bits of humor that are kind of peppered out throughout, surrealism and the thinking within it, and tapping into the unconscious and the child and the play. And I would love to hear more about, Stephanie, in your Beyond Borders show, and Natalie, like within the Menil collection, or even within your scholarship, how you guys approach the humor and embrace the humor, the play, the child within it, within your scholarship and your approach to surrealism.
Yeah. I agree. I think a lot of those little drawings, like the big rock for Little Rock, and that this is not a derrick, is like kind of hysterical. It's a good question. And I might answer it just by saying the Merit Oppenheim exhibition that came to MoMA, we co-curated Menil, MoMA, and the Kunstmuseum Bern. And when it was in Houston, I was like in a way astonished to find how well Merit Oppenheim's humor had been preserved, and how many people really genuinely found a lot of her early surrealist, like 1930s work, very funny in a like very fresh way. I gave a tour to some people and when they saw the shoes, I don't know if anyone remembers those from when they were down the street at MoMA, but it's a pair of white high-heeled pumps that are trussed together like a chicken and presented on an oval-shaped silver platter. And I gave a tour to some people that like genuinely like burst out laughing and were doubled over with laughter, which I thought was amazing. And also we, for our member magazine, this is a little afield, but we, as the cover, reproduced the fur-lined gloves that she made in 1936 that have these wooden fingers in them that are painted with red nail polish. And I heard that a lot of people were very disgusted by that, which I also really liked. Like, they thought it was so gross and sort of visceral and yucky. And again, the fact that the works that are both made in the mid-30s, 90 years later, still are making people laugh or recoil. I don't. Yeah, that it. I mean, that it still works in that way was a really wonderful thing to behold. And so I'm just trying to get out of the way and let that keep happening, in a sense.
Yeah.
I think also humor is a way to make us kind of, like in a space even like this, we take all of this work very seriously and we're looking, or there's something familiar and we're kind of not really looking anymore. And I think humor is a way to kind of like wake us up, right? And ask ourselves, why did something make us laugh? It's not an expected reaction when you're looking at art. And I think that's part of the jolt for Surrealism, and thinking about Magritte especially, and so many of his early works, which I agree are amazing and just razor sharp. Things about the alphabet and forming language and sort of the almost childlike kind of reaction that you may have to them. It's all part of like getting us out of that kind of habit that we can easily fall into. Some days I walk to work and I don't even remember like how I got there. Like it's that kind of habit that I think so much of Surrealism is trying to shake us out of. And humor is a big part of that.
Yeah, certainly. I love that. I'm like still thinking about it, and just in the day-to-day, even like a funny video on YouTube, how that'll like jolt you out or something. And then also, since we have so many students in the audience today, I'm curious, sorry, I'm just looking at my questions and I lost my spot in here, but what ideas from the movement do you think artists today should be, or from the style, beyond the movement, beyond all of that, how do you think artists today can better tap into that surrealist impulse? Stephanie, I feel like you kind of lean toward it in your talk a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think it doesn't mean that if you are open, you are a surrealist, but I think that the idea of, if you're interested in the idea of what lies beyond, if you're interested in, kind of shaking yourself out of habits of seeing or acting or doing, that the things that anyone has written about surrealism, whether it's Breton or it's Télémaque in the 60s or somebody today, I think that there are elements there that can be useful to shake you out of what might be a kind of rut that you're in, or a state of trying to imagine what you can do beyond what you're doing, especially if, I chose specific examples tonight, but I think situations where people face political, social, sexual, artistic inability to be free, Surrealism is a way to help. The methods of Surrealism and the ideas of Surrealists can help us imagine how to see a place beyond where we are.
And Natalie, how about for you?
Well, I agree with Stephanie. I think that under that sort of enlarged scope of understanding, where Surrealism is a kind of liberatory instrument, and one that is also like formally adventurous and playful and humorous sometimes, but also politically engaged, is a real, has a lot of real promise still today.
And I want to be conscious of our time and open the floor up to any questions you might have. In the back there, very quick.
Is it on? No. Thank you. Yes, of course.
Oh, yes.
Oh.
A question, have any studies been done about the surrealism exposed in Hieronymus Bosch's art?
There are definitely studies today that look at surrealism and precedents and antecedents and parallels and things, and there are some studies about, and even the surrealists themselves saw their forebears. And Bosch is definitely one of the artists who's often noted in that kind of conversation. He was not a surrealist, but scholars of surrealism have connected the two, and the surrealists themselves were definitely interested in some historical artists.
Yeah. I think it's quite interesting how, unlike a lot of early 20th century art movements that were kind of similarly at the avant-garde, the Surrealists were interested in the past and finding forerunners or sort of making ancestors for themselves out of old art, which is different than a lot of other artists who are like, no, we're doing everything new, we're starting it all afresh, we're the very first ones ever. And they were quite different from that in the attitude towards art of the past.
If I remember correctly, Magritte said that when he saw The Song of Love by De Chirico, he burst into tears, or he started to cry, and he knew what he had to do. So it seems like there's a really strong connection there. It wasn't like they looked at the past. I mean, this kind of De Chirico was passing something down, at least to him. What about De Chirico? I mean, that was amazing, no?
Yeah, I think De Chirico was like one of the more kind of proximate ancestors that they claimed. I mean, for his metaphysical work from the early 19-teens, like 1911, 12, 13, 14, but with those like abandoned piazzas and mannequins and the strangeness of the paintings, the strangeness of the compositions that seem like they could be photographic in a sense, but are also quite like uncanny and strange and impossible scenes, I think were certainly hugely influential.
And De Chirico was part of the Surrealist circle in Paris and is in a lot of photographs. And you know, the Surrealist, Breton's group had they called it the Bureau for Surrealist Research, where people could come in off the street and sign a book and be part of the method of Surrealism, and they did their seances there and all their stuff. And they had some work in the space, and there was a painting by De Chirico. I think it was kind of really the only artwork. Everything else were like mannequins hanging on the ceiling and a manifesto with forks in it and a painting by De Chirico.
Hi. Carrington wasn't mentioned, even though she's peering down at you. I was wondering what you think about the resurgence of interest in her work and how you think that will affect the way Surrealism is viewed in the future from the feminine lens in research that is going to be done in the future.
I'm sorry, which artist did you say?
Carrington.
Oh, Carrington.
We were just talking about her. I mean, it's interesting because I think there's been a tremendous amount of scholarly interest in Carrington for a while, like a long time, and that in the way that often happens, you know, the market and sort of more popular culture is caught up. But I mean, of course, Carrington's work is amazing and opens onto, you know, more feminist and eco-critical perspectives and accounts of Surrealism. So, I mean, I think it's like so great.
I think that what's interesting also is she's kind of part of a whole posse, you know.
Yes.
There's Remedios Varo and there's Izquierda to a certain extent, and other artists in that group, and it's kind of like nature and a little bit of witchery and feminism, and I think they're lucky, that those artists, because they're part of a you know, strong group. I'm interested to see if other female surrealists, women surrealists, will now, and maybe solos, not part of a group, will now, with her rise, start to have some more attention. And we'll see what happens at Christie's tomorrow night? Tomorrow night.
And I think, and it's like that this also, you know, her story also belongs to the narrative of, I mean, there's lots of different ways that Surrealism is transmitted, and some of it happens through journals and, you know, statements and translations, but also like there's a physical exodus that happens with the group that leaves Europe and is reconstituted in Mexico after the war. And so that's also part of the sort of larger, you know, non-Europeification of Surrealism too. So.
I think we have time for one more question.
I thank you for the lecture. Can you tell us something about the story the origin of Surrealism, exactly how it happened with, I understand, Breton, and if you have a birth date, and who else in the world is doing 100th anniversary celebrations of Surrealism? I have not heard about them.
There are many. There are many. I'm sure Natalie and I could sit down and list off a bunch because we probably see loan letters, requests all the time for our collections. There's a very big one that's happening through the Pompidou. Ironically, it's kind of like recreating to a certain extent the original spread of Surrealism. So it'll be in Paris, and then there's a kind of offshoot of it that will happen in Spain, in Belgium, in Philadelphia. And not really a bedrock necessarily of Surrealism, but an American institution doing a Surrealism.
And somewhere in Germany.
Yes.
Like Hamburg, maybe?
Might be Hamburg. So that's a really big one. But there are lots of
smaller
lots of
ones.
100th anniversary of Surrealist things. So maybe not in New York, ironically, though.
Yeah.
This might be the only one. So kudos to you.
I'll take it.
The origin story is a little bit different because there isn't exactly a birth date. There's a manifesto date, which I think might be October 24th, 1924, or it's the 15th, it's in October 1924. But Surrealism as an idea existed earlier. It was a word that was used to describe a new kind of art, and then a number of different people claimed it for themselves. There were literal fights with canes and people getting hit in the face and all kinds of moments to clean up and sort of claim it for one's own, which is, I think, part of the reason why Breton sort of takes the reign at a certain point and is very, some artists would say very controlling, because he kicked them out, he invited them back in, he official Surrealist this, official that. But it's because it was an idea that had been kind of around, and that there was some fight over ownership when many people owned it. I mean, you could say that Dada and Surrealism sort of came from the same roots, and they sort of diverged maybe between a kind of anti-art for Dada and a kind of more, not optimistic, but a more productive kind of approach for Surrealism. So it's hard to say the origin of Surrealism, unless you know what it is.
No, I think that's quite right. I think quite right with the kind of, it's a real sort of coalescing that happens, right, in 1924, a gathering of disparate threads and then a launch of the movement as such, but not invented from whole cloth by Breton. Yeah.
Well, thank you both
Thank
so
you,
much.
Esther. Thank you.
This was amazing. I hope you all enjoyed it.